It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, we've got a mummy running wild in 1981's Dawn of the Mummy. Dawn of the Mummy was made for a scant $500,000, which was pretty much par for the course for the director Frank Agrama. Now, Agrama was an Egyptian-born American, and he actually opted to go to Egypt to shoot this film, which I think actually plays, particularly in a couple of scenes, it plays to this movie's favor, actually. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But most of the crew who worked on this film were Italian, and typically you'd think seeing a bunch of Italian names in the crew credits would mean that the film is an Italian production. It actually isn't. It really is an American production. However, this would go down as being one of those infamous video nasties that were confiscated and banned in the United Kingdom. Now, while many of the video nasties didn't really deserve their place on the list, this movie is kind of known for being surprisingly graphic in a few scenes. And the combination of that and the thought that, you know, it kind of has a look and feel and attitude of an Italian horror movie, I'll talk a little bit more about that later, too. But let's talk about the interesting figure that is Frank Agrama. Now, Agrama, his other notable film is Queen Kong. Now, I covered that back in July at my website, B Movie Enema, and oh boy, it's pretty bad. But his movies are known for being pretty cheap and mostly falling into the B movie exploitation category. In fact, he was, that Queen Kong movie is kind of one of the earliest examples that I can think of as a mockbuster, meaning that it was specifically made and specifically trying to get out before Paramount's big 1976 King Kong remake got out. And because of all of that, it got roundly sued all over the place. In fact, so much so it couldn't even play in most of the countries in the world until many, many years later. It's kind of an interesting story for such a bad movie that nobody really needs to see anyway. But later in the mid-'80s, he would end up distributing a miniseries called Shaka Zulu, and that's a pretty iffy production that was made in South Africa. And I think there's quite a bit of controversy around like how people are portrayed and so forth in that. But also in the 80s, he founded Harmony Gold USA. That was in 1983 when he did that. And if you run in nerd circles like I do, you know Harmony Gold has been a distributor of Americanized Japanese, particularly anime. And for the better part of the last 40 years has more or less squatted on the rights to Robotech, which was originally known in its native Japan as Macross. Now, if I understand it correctly, the reason why you can't see the original source material Macross in this country is due to Harmony Gold's hawkish claim to Robotech. So basically, you know, if you want to see that, you might already consider Agrama a bit of a villain, because there's no way to legally get that distributed over here. It's kind of crazy how close-knit and close-kept Harmony Gold has kept all of that imagery here on this side of the world. It seems almost impossible that they were allowed to do that. But in another way, Agrama is kind of, sort of, a villain in the eyes of another country. He was the focus of a massive fraud scheme. So according to how I've understood the story around this, Mediaset, which was an Italian company owned by a media tycoon and former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, with Agrama, as well as 12 others, they were indicted over tax fraud and embezzlement equal to over $62 million euros. Basically, it had something to do with film rights being traded around illegally between Mediaset and other foreign companies. Now, by the time that Agrama was found guilty in 2012, he was already too old to serve any jail time based on Italian law. So he and the other co-defendants were also ordered to pay a 10 million euro fine, which was pretty much all that Agrama really had to do. And I think there might have been a probation in lieu of the prison sentence because he was already over the age of 70. But there was another controversy dealing with Mediaset subsidiary Mediatrade and Agrama, along with Harmony Gold and other companies, in which rights to films and TV shows from the United States were being sold to other countries at inflated prices. However, that second charge did not really land Agrama in any additional trouble because he was acquitted after an appeal. So, Agrama is kind of an interesting fella, but is Dawn of the Mummy also interesting? Well, let's find out. So the movie starts fast with Egyptian raiders going out into the land and whipping and manhandling a bunch of peasants. They seem to have stolen away with mostly the younger people in this village. And, you know, it's kind of funny because right out of the gate here, I am pretty sure there will be few things this movie will truly be remembered for, but I will say it should be commended that this movie used actual Egyptian folks, or at least people who look area accurate, to play Egyptians. A lot of movies, particularly small budget movies, would just put a bunch of makeup on white folks, or, well, maybe even do that in big budget films up until the last few years. But it's not, it is fairly notable. It's not to be ignored that this was actually fairly accurate. But these peasants were nabbed in order to serve a man named Sephirama. Now, when Sephirama dies, and much like with a lot of other nobility in Egypt, these peasants are going to also be entombed with their master, and they are eventually killed by poison gas, and they are sealed into the tomb, and a curse is laid onto the tomb that states that whoever opens the tomb will die when Sephirama and his servants awaken as undead killing machines. Now, naturally, 4,000 years later, a trio of grave robbers have blasted open the tomb. Now, the main guy of these Tomb Raiders, Rick, has left his two goons, Tarek and Karib, to basically guard the now open tomb from any potential other people who might come along to try to get in there and take the gold that they're looking for. But he says that they can't go inside anyway because, according to him, the air is poison. He says that's a booby trap that's used to kill those who enter as soon as they open the tomb. But as he leaves, Tarek and Karib are also warned by a old hag that lives nearby, who rants and raves and goes on tirades about how they should not have disturbed the tomb, they shouldn't have opened it, and there's a concern that Sephirama has returned. But later that night, other guys who believe they've been unfairly cut out of this obviously get-rich-quick scheme decide to go inside the tomb while Tarek and Karib are dealing with the old lady. If the sour air wasn't bad enough causing these people to have trouble breathing, the other raiders are attacked by something in the tomb. But then we go over to New York City, and that's where we meet a group of models and the modeling agency that they work for. Each of the girls that we meet are hired to do a photo shoot in Egypt. The girls are Lisa, Melinda, and June, and then there's Jenny, who is the makeup person for this agency. We also meet Gary, who I believe is another male model, and Bill, the director of this whole shoot. Now, as the group's two Jeeps drive along the desert, one of the Jeeps gets a flat tire and has to pull over. And while they are getting that repaired, Lisa and Gary go for a walk, but Lisa falls down a dune and rolls right into where the decapitated heads of the grave robbers from the previous scene are found lying in the sand. Back at the tomb, Rick, Carib, and Tariq are blasting open and walk into what they think is the treasure room. But what they actually find is just a bunch of ceramics and pottery. And Rick says they just have to keep blasting rooms open in order to find the right room with all the gold. Now, while they were messing about and eventually discover Sephiroth's sarcophagus, the models are doing their thing outside. However, because the two groups are close, Karib starts to shoot at the models, believing them to potentially be vandals. But now the two groups are mixed up together because the girls think it's super neat to go inside the tomb. And in fact, when they realize the Rick and crew have uncovered a mummy, Bill decides this is where they're going to do the photo shoot. Forget all the camels and the sand and the stuff outside. They're going to do it right here with a real live mummy. Now, as they shoot, goop is starting to ooze from Sephiroth's body, and it would seem as though he's about to potentially get up and go for a stroll. But one of the girls, Jenny, gets some of the goop on her hand, and it basically acts like acid, burning her. And pretty much for the rest of the movie, she's wearing a bandage with very clear open wound, kind of seeping through the bandage. Now, the next day, Karib finds the gold inside the wrappings of Sephiroth, but he's quickly killed. The next day, as the model crew returns, the mummy of Sephiroth stirs and begins to actually move and then sits up. And later that night, 2 more bodies are discovered by the girls. Rick tries to tell Gary that tries to tell Bill and Gary that they basically need to leave, but Bill refuses. He says that he just needs one more day inside the tomb. And quite frankly, things are starting to ramp up a little bit, and I don't know if it's a good idea for them to stick around because Sephiroth has killed the old hag, and at dawn, his servants begin to rise from the ground. Gary and Jenny go into town to get a smoke at the hookah bar, and while Gary partakes in the hookah, the man who provided the pipe, named Omar, they strike up a conversation to become fast friends, and he tells Gary that he's getting married tomorrow and invites him to the wedding. Now, meanwhile, Jenny is walking through the town. She spots Rick doing something, and as she's watching him, she then turns and believes she sees the mummy, but when she runs back to Gary, he doesn't believe what she says she saw. Now, Sephiroth went into town indeed to kill Tariq. And back at the camp, Lisa and Melinda have decided to go for a swim at a nearby oasis. And Lisa decides to return to the camp. And alone at the oasis, Melinda is ultimately attacked by Sephiroth's servant mummies, and she's killed by having her throat ripped out. And then she's basically pulled underground with the rest of the mummies. Now, after discovering Tariq's body, Rick returns to the tomb to find Sephiroth to try to kill him. But instead, he finds the treasure room with all the gold and then ends up meeting his end when Sephiroth kills him first. That night, Gary goes to Omar's wedding, and Bill goes to try to find Rick in the tomb, only to find that he finds Rick's decapitated head, and as he tries to run away, the servant mummies come to finish him off. But he basically tries to run and escape, but Sephiroth finishes him off, and then the rest of his guys chase after the girls. Lisa and June are able to escape on horseback, but Jenny is overwhelmed and eaten by the mummies. When the girls go into town to try to find Gary, basically he's the only one left of either group that we met earlier in the film. that is still alive. And at the wedding, Omar goes to retrieve his bride for the ceremony, only to find the mummies feasting on her. Then the mummies start attacking and feeding on pretty much everyone in town. And at this point, there seems to be no rhyme or reason for who the mummies are eating, but whatever. There also seems to be a bunch more mummies than we thought. But eventually, Sephiroth is kind of led into a shed where there is a bunch of dynamite, and it's lit, and it blows up, and it also seemingly takes the mummy with him. Lisa, June, and Gary survive and walk away, but Sephiroth's hand busts out of the rubble, revealing that he was not blown up after all. So let's get to finding 3 things I like about this movie. First, I freaking love the guy who plays Rick, the Tomb Raider. That guy is George Peck. Now, he appeared in a handful of movies, mostly uncredited, but in this, he is going hard. He is insane. Basically, he knows exactly what he's doing, and he is playing it so over the top that it's a joy to watch. He has this wide-eyed insanity as he tells the mummy of Sephiroth that he wants his gold more than he does. He looks a little like Tim Thomerson, another kind of character actor from the 80s, but the energy he's bringing is bonkers. It's great from moment one when he first showed up, and after he discovers Tarek's body, it's a masterclass of how nutty he can get in this. The eyes get bigger, the yelling gets louder, the general insanity just increases tenfold. And that's before he has a total freak out when he discovers the treasure inside the tomb before he gets killed by Sephiroth. It's just a great performance. Second, I really like the scene in which the servant mummies rise out of the sand at dawn. It's a very quick moment, but it's a great visual. You have the hands and bodies kind of rising up out of the sand against the rising sun and the desert. This is one of the great things about this being shot in Egypt. It creates this nice authenticity, if you will. And with the desert for miles and that sunrise, it really does give you that great shot, and the monsters coming out of the ground is just perfect. Thirdly, Dawn of the Mummy is notable for one specific thing. The mummies here are more like zombies, and maybe one of the only scenarios in which they've ever been treated as such. They go out and they're eating flesh. They're not just mummies that are protecting a tomb or strangling somebody that is getting in the way or whatever. And generally speaking, if anything is ever written or spoken about the movie, it's this fact. And I think that also helps with the misconception that this is an Italian movie. The mummies look like Italian zombies in this, and they aren't the typical wrapped up zombies, or the wrapped up mummies, really. They're more like you see their faces, you see their bodies. Sure, the guy playing Sephiroth looks like how Christopher Lee did in the Hammer Films Mummy movie, with a slender frame and a little bit more lanky. But these mummies don't follow the bandaged up mummies that we expect to see. And I also think that the final 20 or so minutes is frenetic and fairly insane, much like an Italian movie. The first hour of the movie pretty much reserves a lot of the killing and spaces it out pretty well. Also, the mummy doesn't just get up immediately and start killing everyone. There seems to be some sort of guidelines or rules in which it takes Sephiroth to actually revive fully. And that means 2/3 of this movie does a good job of building and spacing out all of the major horrors. But the final act, it's wall-to-wall mummy buffet at that point. I don't even exactly know everything that happened and how it happened and who all got killed and how. But when it does play out like this, it plays out like an Italian zombie movie. You get the trickles of gore and scares, and then the final act and the big climax goes way off the rails in a sort of good way. It makes this movie enjoyable in a way that if you're into the Italian horror stuff, particularly the zombie and to a lesser extent, maybe the cannibal stuff of this era, you'll probably at least have a good time watching Dawn of the Mummy. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we head to an Alabama Army base where an alien invasion is underway in the 1993 Body Snatchers remake directed by Abel Ferrara. So until next week, stay spooky.